You're about to lose this house? My neighbor laughed. Code enforcement is finally coming, and everyone will see what kind of mess you live in. I looked at the inspector stepping out of the truck. Then something unexpected made him stop and turn toward the other yard. My name is Brooke Sullivan, and I am 34 years old. If you had met me a year ago, you probably would have called me ordinary. I wasn't famous. I didn't have a fancy career or a huge bank account. I worked as a landscape designer for a small local company, helping families turn neglected yards into places they actually enjoyed spending time in. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. There was something satisfying about bringing life back to a forgotten space. Buying my first home had been my biggest dream. It wasn't a large house. The roof needed repairs. The fence leaned a little too far to one side. The flower beds were filled with weeds when I moved in. But every cracked brick and every patch of overgrown grass felt like an opportunity instead of a burden. I spent nearly every weekend fixing something. Some Saturdays I painted old shutters. Other weekends I planted flowers or repaired broken garden borders. My neighbors often saw me outside wearing faded jeans, old gloves, and a baseball cap covered with dirt. I didn't mind. Every improvement reminded me that this place was finally mine. The mortgage wasn't easy to pay. I skipped vacations. I drove the same 10-year-old sedan. I packed lunch instead of eating out with coworkers. Every dollar mattered. Still, every evening when I unlocked my front door, I smiled. I had earned this home. Most of my neighborhood had lived there for decades. Families knew one another, they celebrated birthdays together, watched each other's children grow up, and shared holiday decorations every year. I was the newcomer. At first, I thought everyone would eventually warm up to me. Most people did. They waved politely. Some introduced themselves. A retired couple across the street even brought me homemade cookies during my first week. But one person made it clear I wasn't welcome. His name was Gary. From the first day, he acted as if my house offended him personally. The grass is getting too long, he'd complain while standing on his porch. A few days later, he'd shake his head. Those flower pots don't match the neighborhood. Another week passed. You really should repaint that mailbox. At first, I thought he was trying to be helpful. Then I realized something. No matter what I fixed, he always found something new to criticize. One afternoon, I smiled and said, "Thanks for the advice, Gary. I'll get to it when I can." He crossed his arms. "You should have done it already." I simply nodded and walked back inside. Arguing wasn't my style. Life had already taught me that some people weren't looking for solutions, they were looking for control. So I focused on my own life. I worked hard during the week. I improved my property on weekends. I stayed polite even when Gary wasn't. People at work often asked why I looked tired. "I've been replacing fence boards," I'd laugh. "You know, most people hire someone for that," my coworker Emily joked. "I can't afford that," I answered. "Besides, I like knowing I built something myself." She smiled. "That's why you'll finish. Most people quit halfway." Those words stayed with me. I wasn't rich or glamorous, but I had something they didn't expect. I was patient. I believed steady effort eventually beat loud opinions. Unfortunately, Gary believed the opposite. Every small improvement I made seemed to irritate him even more. If I planted flowers, he'd complain they attracted bees. If I trimmed bushes, he'd claim the branches crossed the property line. If I parked my car in my own driveway, somehow that became another problem. It felt exhausting. Still, I refused to become the angry neighbor everyone whispered about. I reminded myself that peace was worth protecting. I had no idea Gary was already planning something much bigger than complaints. If you've ever felt underestimated because of where you started or judged before anyone knew your story, subscribe and join this community. I'd love to hear about your own experiences in the comments because you're definitely not alone. Click hype or leave a like if you've ever had to prove people wrong simply by refusing to give up. The first official complaint arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I found a notice taped to my front door. It informed me that someone had reported excessive weeds and improper outdoor storage. I stared at the paper in disbelief. My yard? I whispered. I walked outside. The grass had been cut 3 days earlier. The garden tools mentioned in the complaint were neatly stored inside my small shed. Nothing matched the report. When the inspector arrived 2 days later, he introduced himself with a friendly smile. I'm just here to verify the complaint, he said. No problem, I replied. Please look wherever you need. He walked around the property carefully. After 15 minutes, he closed his notebook. I don't see any violations today. I let out a quiet breath. Thank you. He smiled. Looks like you're taking good care of the place. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, another complaint appeared. This time, someone claimed I had unsafe fencing. Again, an inspector came. Again, nothing was wrong. Then came another report. And another. Each accusation was different. Each inspection ended the same way. No violations found. The inspectors remained professional, but I could tell they were beginning to recognize my address. One afternoon, an inspector sighed before getting back into his truck. I wish more complaints looked like this, he said with a small smile. I laughed awkwardly. I wish fewer complaints were made. He nodded. I don't blame you. The pattern continued for nearly 2 months. Every time I thought it had finally stopped, another notice appeared. I still didn't know who kept filing them. Then everything became painfully clear. At the neighborhood barbecue, Gary stood near the picnic table surrounded by several neighbors. He pointed directly at me. Enjoy the free food while you can, he called loudly. People turned toward us. What do you mean? Someone asked. Gary grinned. Code enforcement is finally going to catch everything she's hiding. Just wait. Those fines are coming. A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away, embarrassed. I felt every pair of eyes land on me. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I looked at Gary and calmly said, I've passed every inspection. For now, he answered with a smug smile. The conversation died. No one knew what to say. I quietly picked up my plate and left before anyone could see how embarrassed I felt. The very next morning, another white inspection truck slowly pulled into my driveway. This time, though, the inspector paused before even knocking on my door. His eyes weren't on my house anymore. They were fixed on something sitting just beyond my fence in Gary's backyard. The inspector stood silently for several seconds, studying something beyond my fence. I followed his gaze. At first, I couldn't tell what had caught his attention. Then he walked a few steps closer to the property line, pulled out a small camera, and took several photos. My heart pounded. What is it? I asked. He looked back at me with a polite smile. I need to finish checking your property first. I nodded. Of course. 10 minutes later, he closed his notebook. Everything on your property is in compliance. Relief washed over me. Then he turned toward Gary's yard. I'll be speaking with your neighbor. I watched him knock on Gary's front door. Gary answered with the same smug confidence he always wore whenever he believed he had won. Did you finally find something? He asked loudly enough for me to hear. The inspector didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the large detached shed behind Gary's garage. I have a few questions about that structure. Gary frowned. What structure? The one behind your garage. Oh, that? Gary laughed. That's been there forever. The inspector wrote something down. May I see the permits? Gary's smile faded just a little. I don't have them here. No problem, the inspector replied calmly. We'll verify everything. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I saw uncertainty cross Gary's face. He wasn't laughing anymore. I quietly went inside. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. Something told me this wasn't over. Not even close. Over the next week, strange things started happening. Neighbors who usually waved at me suddenly looked away. Two women stopped talking the moment I walked into the neighborhood mailbox area. One afternoon, I heard someone whisper, "She's causing trouble." Another voice answered, "I heard she's trying to get people fined." I stopped walking. What? Both women looked embarrassed. Oh, nothing. No, I said calmly. Please tell me. One of them sighed. Gary told everyone you've been reporting houses because you don't like the neighborhood. I stared at her. That's not true. She shrugged. I'm just telling you what I heard. I walked home feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. Now I understood. The inspections hadn't been enough for Gary. He wanted everyone to believe I was the problem. That weekend, I opened the neighborhood social media page. My name wasn't mentioned directly. It didn't have to be. Someone had posted photos of my backyard taken from strange angles. The caption read, "Some people move in and destroy the character of our community." Dozens of comments followed. That's terrible. Property values matter. The HOA should step in. I recognized the photos immediately. Someone had stood near the fence to make my yard look messy while I was in the middle of replacing garden beds. The bags of mulch, stacked lumber, and tools were temporary. The project wasn't finished. But the pictures made it look like I had turned my backyard into a junkyard. I felt sick. My phone buzzed. It was Emily from work. I just saw that neighborhood post. So did I. Are you okay? I sighed. Not really. People can be awful. They don't even know the truth. Emily paused, then let the truth catch up. Simple words, but they stayed with me. The following Monday, another letter arrived. This one wasn't from code enforcement. It was from the Homeowners Association. According to the notice, several residents had complained about my property's appearance. They requested a meeting. I couldn't believe it. I had spent nearly every free hour improving my home. Now I was being treated like someone who didn't care. At the HOA meeting, Gary sat near the front with his arms folded. When I walked in, he smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone enjoying another person's discomfort. The board president cleared his throat. We've received several complaints. I nodded. I understand. Gary interrupted. Maybe if she respected the neighborhood, we wouldn't be wasting everyone's time. I turned toward him. I've passed every inspection. He shrugged. That doesn't mean you're a good neighbor. The room became quiet. One board member looked at me. Do you have anything you'd like to say? Yes. I stood. I've worked every weekend restoring my home. Every inspection has found no violations. I've never filed a complaint against anyone. I simply want to live peacefully. A few people exchanged uncertain looks. Gary rolled his eyes. Nice speech. The board decided not to issue any penalties because there wasn't enough evidence. As everyone stood to leave, Gary muttered just loud enough for me to hear. This isn't over. I looked him straight in the eyes. I know. For weeks afterward, I noticed something strange. Code enforcement trucks weren't visiting my house anymore. Instead, they kept stopping in front of Gary's. Surveyors measured parts of his property. Inspectors walked around the detached shed. They examined a tall fence along the back lot. One afternoon, they spent nearly 2 hours there. Gary looked furious. He argued with them from the driveway while pointing toward my house. The inspectors barely looked in my direction. That was when I realized something important. Whatever they had found had nothing to do with me anymore. The investigation had completely changed. And Gary still had no idea how serious it was becoming. I wish I could tell you that I felt satisfied watching Gary panic. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired. For months I had walked around my own neighborhood wondering who would believe the next rumor about me. I had questioned whether buying this house had been a mistake. More than once I had sat on my back porch after sunset listening to the crickets and the distant barking of dogs, asking myself one simple question. Why me? The answer finally became clear. Gary had never cared about my flowers. He didn't care about my mailbox, my fence, or my lawn. He wanted control. The complaints were never about code violations. They were about making me feel unwelcome. What he didn't know was that I had stopped thinking like a victim a long time ago. After the third inspection, I had started keeping records. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted peace. Every notice from code enforcement went into a labeled folder. Every inspection report was scanned onto my laptop. Every email from the HOA was saved. I even kept screenshots of neighborhood posts before they were deleted. Whenever Gary made another public accusation, I wrote down the date, the time, and who had been present. It became a habit. Quiet, organized, careful. One afternoon, Emily noticed me sorting papers during lunch. She looked at the growing stack of folders. Planning a lawsuit? She joked. I smiled. No. Then what's all this? Insurance. She laughed. What kind of insurance? The kind that protects the truth. Her smile faded. That's actually smart. I hope I never need it. But if you do, I'll be ready. She nodded. Good. That conversation stayed with me. I wasn't collecting paperwork because I expected to win some dramatic battle. I simply refused to let someone rewrite reality. Then something happened that changed everything. I submitted a routine public records request. Nothing complicated. I only wanted copies of the complaints filed against my property. When the documents arrived, I spent an evening reading every page at my kitchen table. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room while the ceiling fan hummed quietly above me. One page became two. Two became 10. Patterns started appearing. Nearly every complaint had been filed within hours of Gary arguing with me. The wording was almost identical every time. Several reports even included details that could only have come from someone standing in his own yard. I leaned back in my chair. So it really was him. I wasn't surprised anymore. I was certain. Then I noticed another detail. Some inspection notes mentioned observations unrelated to my property. One sentence caught my attention. Possible unpermitted accessory structure observed on adjacent parcel. Another report referenced concerns about electrical work visible from outside the neighboring property. I read the line 3 times. Gary had spent months inviting inspectors onto our street. Each visit gave them another opportunity to notice things beyond my fence. I couldn't help shaking my head. He had opened the door himself. Still, I kept every document neatly organized. I had a plan they never saw coming. Not a plan to destroy Gary. A plan to protect myself with facts instead of anger. The truth was finally beginning to build its own case. I just needed someone who understood exactly how to use it. That someone turned out to be Daniel Harper, the senior landscape architect who had mentored me since my first day on the job. Daniel had spent more than 30 years working on residential and commercial projects. He knew zoning rules, permit requirements, and city procedures better than almost anyone I had ever met. When I asked if he had time to look over my paperwork, he didn't hesitate. "Bring everything," he said. "We'll sort it out." The next evening, I spread the folders across the conference table in his office. Daniel adjusted his reading glasses and quietly worked through every document. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. Nearly an hour passed before he looked up. "You've done something most people never think to do." "I just kept records." "You documented a pattern." "Is that important?" He smiled. "It's extremely important." I felt hope for the first time in months. He tapped one inspection report. "These aren't emotional arguments." "No, they're facts." "Exactly." He nodded approvingly. "Facts usually outlast loud people." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Meanwhile, Gary seemed more confident than ever. He walked around the neighborhood acting as though he had already won. One Saturday morning, I heard him talking to another neighbor. "She won't last another year here." "What makes you so sure?" the neighbor asked. Gary grinned. "People like her always leave." I kept walking without saying a word. He wanted a reaction. He wasn't getting one. 2 days later, another white city truck parked in front of his house. Then another. By the end of the week, bright orange markings had appeared around the detached shed in his backyard. Gary spent nearly an hour arguing with two inspectors on the sidewalk. His voice echoed across the street. "I've lived here 20 years. One inspector answered calmly. "Sir, we're simply following procedure." Gary threw his hands into the air. "This is ridiculous." Across the street, I watched from my porch with Daniel's words echoing in my mind. Facts usually outlast loud people. Something told me the biggest confrontation was no longer a question of if. It was only a matter of when. The answer came 3 weeks later. Every homeowner on our street received an email from the HOA announcing a special community meeting. Attendance was strongly encouraged. No reason was given. The room at the neighborhood clubhouse filled quickly that Thursday evening. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as people settled in. Quiet conversations bounced off the walls. Gary arrived wearing a confident smile. He looked around the room as if he expected to watch someone else's downfall. When he noticed me sitting near the back, he smirked. "You ready for another long night?" he asked. I smiled politely. "I guess we'll find out." He chuckled and took his seat. A few minutes later, the HOA president stood. "Thank you everyone for coming." The room became quiet. "We have representatives from code enforcement with us tonight." Two inspectors walked to the front. I immediately recognized the lead inspector who had visited my home several times. He opened a folder. "This meeting concerns repeated complaints filed within this neighborhood and the investigation that followed." Gary folded his arms with confidence. The inspector continued. "Over the past several months, our office received numerous complaints regarding one property." Gary nodded proudly. Then everything changed. Each complaint resulted in an inspection. The inspector paused. While those inspections found no significant violations at the reported property, they repeatedly revealed visible concerns on an adjacent property. The room became silent. Gary's smile disappeared. "What?" he blurted. The inspector calmly turned a page. Our investigation confirmed that the detached structure behind your residence was built without the required permits. Several neighbors gasped. The inspector continued. Electrical work connected to that structure also failed to meet local safety requirements. Gary stood up. That's impossible. Sir, the inspector replied. Our records show no approved permits. There has to be some mistake. We searched records going back more than 20 years. Gary looked around the room. No. The inspector wasn't finished. The rear fence exceeds permitted height in several sections and extends beyond the documented property boundary. Gary shook his head. No, no, no. Another inspector spoke. Because repeated complaints initiated multiple inspections, these violations were eventually documented. Someone sitting near the front whispered. So, he reported himself? A few quiet laughs spread across the room. Gary turned bright red. This is her fault. He pointed directly at me. She planned this. The lead inspector looked at him. Ma'am never filed a complaint against you. Gary froze. The inspector continued. In fact, public records show the complaints originated from your address. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. People looked from Gary to me and back again. One neighbor who had avoided me for weeks slowly lowered her head. The HOA president cleared his throat. Mr. Collins, is that true? Gary tried to answer. I was just protecting the neighborhood. Another neighbor spoke up. By making false reports. I so could nice. He couldn't finish. I slowly stood. I'd like to say something. The room became quiet again. I carried one folder to the front. I never wanted any of this. I opened the folder. These are copies of every inspection report, every HOA letter, and every complaint filed against my property. I handed them to the HOA president. I kept records because I wanted the truth, not revenge. The president flipped through several pages. His eyebrows rose. This is incredibly organized. Daniel, seated quietly in the second row, smiled but said nothing. The lead inspector nodded toward the documents. They match our official records. I looked around the room. For months I was accused of lowering property values. No one interrupted. I was told I didn't belong here. Several neighbors looked embarrassed. I was treated like a problem even though every inspection cleared my property. The retired couple from across the street exchanged guilty looks. Then Mrs. Parker slowly stood. Look. I looked at her. I'm sorry. Her voice trembled. I believed the rumors. Another neighbor nodded. So did I. One by one, others apologized. Not everyone spoke. Some simply lowered their eyes. Gary remained standing in silence. The confidence he had carried for months had completely disappeared. The inspector closed his folder. You'll receive formal notices explaining the required corrections and deadlines. Gary quietly sat down. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, he had nothing to say. The meeting ended with people gathering into small groups. This time they weren't whispering about me. They were talking about what had really happened. As I walked toward the parking lot, Daniel caught up with me. You okay? I smiled. I think I finally am. You handled that well. I almost didn't. He nodded. But you did. I looked back at the clubhouse. I spent months wanting people to believe me. And now, I don't need everyone to like me. He smiled. That's freedom. The weeks that followed felt completely different. The city required Gary to correct every violation before specific deadlines. Construction crews arrived to remove part of the oversized fence. A detached shed had to be brought into compliance through permits and repairs before it could legally remain. For the first time since I moved in, Gary stayed quiet. No more shouted comments. No more surprise complaints. No more rumors. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped to chat. Mrs. Parker brought over blueberry muffins one Saturday morning. I owe you another apology, she said. You don't owe me anything. I do. I smiled. The past is the past. The retired couple invited me to their annual 4th of July cookout. Several neighbors even asked for landscaping advice. Life slowly became what I had hoped it would be when I first bought the house. Peaceful. One evening I sat on my porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The neighborhood sounded different now. Children laughed. Dogs barked. Sun moved softly through the leaves. No tension. No fear. Just home. Looking back, I realized something important. The truth doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it works quietly. Sometimes it takes patience. Sometimes it needs good records. But sooner or later, the truth has a way of introducing itself. If you've ever had someone make false accusations against you or try to turn